Hello there, 3D students. Okay, so you're about to start your wire project. And in the kits you received at the beginning of the semester, you have 3 tools that will be key to that project. There are the needle nose pliers. One thing I'll point out about the needle nose pliers is it has a little cutter in this part right here. So you can cut wire right there. Also, these are nice spring-loaded action. Needle nose pliers. Know them, love them. And you also have a pair of nice little small wire cutters. These have a pointed tip, which are good for getting into little tight spaces if you're really trying to get into a narrow place that you've made. So here you have some aluminum 18 gauge wire. What does gauge mean, first of all? So 18 gauge refers to the thickness of the wire, this material. You'll also see that your wire is pretty flexible. It's big, but it does hold shape well. And this little bit of material here theoretically is a cutter. Is this right? Yes, no? I'll probably edit this part out. Looky there. Okay, so just by finagling around underneath this wire edge, it cut the wire. One reason it does that might be due to the concept of work hardening, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Anyway, this is your go-to material for your wire project. It's very soft, and you can shape it into any means you can. Now, as you notice, see, as I work around with this, and it starts to kind of get little bends that are very difficult to try to straighten out. You kind of can, but the material also, the more you bend it, the more rigid it might become. The term I mentioned, work hardening, that comes from the fact that metal sort of behaves a little bit more like liquid than we might think. But this is why this happens. I did nothing but twist this and it came off. It's because the little spot that was being worked back and forth went through the process of what is called work hardening, and it just breaks in half. I'm not pulling it, it just kind of comes in half. So keep that in mind. Be aware to not over manipulate your metal or it will break on you. And I hope you don't have that frustrating situation. So the key here, after you have your line drawings of your object, and I think you benefit from doing drawings from multiple angles, you're then going to start to bend wire to mimic the shapes that you see, whatever those might be. And I recommend don't cut your wire if possible, because getting to join wire in a rigid manner is going to require either lots and lots of twisting around, which is not as tidy looking as a simple wire, or maybe even some glue, which is it's not a good look. But you do what you have to do sometimes. Okay, so in manipulating wire, one thing to keep in mind is that you can take your needle nose pliers and imagine if you want to make a texture, and I am threading this around the tip of the wire, the tip of the needle nose pliers to make a sort of coil. I'm using the needle nose pliers as what is called a mandrel, which is something that you shape metal on. Now, will I be able to get this out of here? That's a good question. Okay, I'm gonna pop that open a little. I'm learning by doing in all these videos. Can you tell? How am I gonna get this out of here? I'm gonna stretch. Nope. Okay, let's pause on this. Okay, I ended up just unwinding that coil from the needle nose pliers because it wouldn't come off. But I did end up with a kind of interesting, springy coil shape. And this is flat. You could also stretch it out to kind of create a cone type shape, even though that's a little gnarly looking. Okay, I'm going to snip this off and experiment a little bit with wrapping on a cylindrical object. So this will give you a nice even coil. You have to hold it down at the start to get it started, and then eventually you can kind of just turn it. And you can keep going endlessly with this. Slip that right out, and you have sort of a spring shape. Then you can stretch that out if you want, make kind of cool slinky, or even make a round, bring it all the way around, and you kind of have like a blossom shape. I'm just going to take this end and turn it over so that it's not sticking out. And now I have a little round blossom shape. I'm not in focus. There we go. So with wire, be creative with how to create volume. That's one way. Now, of course, you don't have to use something like a pen. It's like a nice little flower there. You can also use more rectilinear items to create shapes. So here I have just a block of wood, and I've cut a piece off, and I'm going to bend it. This is a nice way to get great sharp corners. Okay, and then just oh, it's always harder than I think it's going to be. I'm going to loosen the tension a little bit so I can actually get this thing off of here. Okay, from both ends. Theoretically, both ends. Okay. That actually is kind of cool, just as it is. But if you really wanted a square tube, you would just twist it back into shape. Oops. So think about if you want to take advantage of very rectilinear objects in order to mimic your object, chosen item that you're depicting. Use these things to create great sharp corners. You could use the edge of the table even. What if we twisted that way? Don't be afraid to use objects. And then look, that's twisted. Just give that a little curve and that becomes something new. Looks kind of like a dental retainer. Okay, so you can also use a very large thing and craft a rounded sort of item. Think about using objects as what you would call in woodworking and such a jig, so that you can repeat shapes if you need to. What if you have an item that has multiple forms? It would be great if you could set up a way to make identical looking shapes that repeat that, which could take shape from a round object like this or something square, just whatever you need. When it comes to time that you're going to have to connect two pieces of metal together, there are a few ways you could do it. And honestly, it's just going to take some experimentation to see what works best and is the tidiest looking way to connect them. A really simple way, here's two wires, and I'm just going to fold it back as if we have two interlocking U shapes. I mean, they're connected, but they're 100% loose and wiggly. You can increase that by, what happens if we wrap it double? You can see I'm also experimenting too. So I've just wrapped back through the other string one more time. Okay, so that's more rigid, moderately tidy looking. Always try to bend your ends in so that you're not stabbing yourself as you work, because that's not fun. Also, working with this aluminum wire, there's an oxidation that comes off on your fingers. So it is possible to get a fairly rigid, still springy, connection between two wires through rather simple looping back and forth and wrapping. Before you get started on these projects, it's best to just experiment a little bit. Analyze what sections you might need to combine in your project, and then think about how you want them to look. Do you want it to be nice and tidy? Do you want to take advantage of? So here I'm going to combine a couple things. Here I've got a simple loop going on, and now, oh, what's small? Let's see, this will probably work. I'm going to wrap this around here just a little. If I had a smaller material like a chopstick or something skinny, like a skewer, well, that's not working at all. Then I can make something a little better. Even just bending back and forth can create an interesting little sort of line. A good practice would be to try to spell out your own name in wire. That would be a good way to just sort of get the hang of this material before you jump into your project. Actually, I think I might add that as a warm-up project for my students. Another thing about using physical forms to create wire shapes. You could take something like this beautiful hardwood block. Take your wire. Also, one thing that is always helpful is pull more out than you think you're going to need, because it's great to have an excess, so when you cut the tail, you're not cutting it too close to the thing you're trying to make. So if you have to describe a three-dimensional form only using line, sometimes in drawing we think about having a line that crosses back and forth across the surface to describe this plane. Essentially, you could do the same thing with wire. If you hold the wire on there and just go back and forth. Holding it as you go. Now, if you wanted to describe this whole shape, obviously you would go all the way down to the bottom edge. I am not doing that, but I'll give it a shot to see how well. Also good to wear eye protection if you're working with wire like this, because as you see, there's wire flying around. It's pretty dangerous and could hit you in the eye. The eye is the only thing they can't replace, so keep them safe. Okay, so this is a slightly wonky, but could be effective horizontal plane out of wire. It does describe a form. Another thing about wire gauges, I mentioned that this is 18 gauge wire and it's pretty thin. I happen to have some thicker gauge copper wire from a recent electrical project, and it's probably a 12 or 14 gauge wire. It's thicker, as you can tell, and the wire is also a lot harder than the aluminum. If you just rely on your fingers to bend it, you'll have sore fingers pretty soon. So I would definitely use tools. Not that you're going to have this, but if you are interested in working with metal in the future, copper is a great material to work with, and it's really beautiful. And you can work with different chemicals to achieve different patinas and things. But just to show you how lucky you are to get to work with aluminum wire instead of copper, this is for this project. I thought I'd show it to you. And that whole work hardening thing happens with copper too. And you know how it'll heat up in your fingers as you do that? That is the energy taking place, and this is heating up, and eventually it breaks. The metal becomes brittle and it will just break in half. You can also restore that elasticity in metal by heating it up to a very high temperature, and that will re-soften the metal where you can manipulate it more easily. So, metal. I hope you go forth into greater things.